Hey everybody, you know me, I'm Alex. PGY-2, today is my RPR on food, medicine, and capitalism. Okay, so objectives of today. We're gonna review a brief history of industrialized agriculture and food processing, explore links between diet and chronic disease, reflect on the medical industrial complex complicity in the chronic disease epidemic. We're gonna learn about some initiatives for improving our food system, and we're gonna share our ideas and thoughts and feelings about diet and nutrition. Okay, so everybody, as you're getting ready, I want you to close your eyes, settle yourself, and I want you to, I'm gonna conjure an image in your mind. What if I told you that there's a profession that started off as a noble craft with aims of helping people, but over the years, increasing corporatization and consolidation have made those professionals more accountable to those corporations than the people that they're trying to help? The practitioners suffer moral injury, and suicide rates of these professionals are higher than the general population. And I'm trying to understand, I want to know what image is in your mind. Is it someone like this? Is it any one of us or any one of our attendings? I hope throughout this lecture to be able to share that we are inextricably connected, and we should think that this is just as good, if not the right image to conjure, image to conjure of the professional. So let's start with the farmer. How has capitalism and industrialization changed the work of the farmer? We're going to talk about wonderbread for a minute, okay? So bread is made from wheat. Wheat has a shell and a husk and an endosperm full of starch. In Europe and in the West, racism in particular has shaped the idea that white bread is more pure and better. And more sought out. That would involve removing the husk and the wheat seed and leaving only the starchy part. As there was more of a demand for convenience, and because white flour was shelf stable, the industries could mass produce it and market it to the masses in plastic packaging and sell it in stores. This is the story of Wonder Bread. And it skyrocketed, and they advertised saying, we build strong bodies in 8 ways, and then they said 12 ways, and then they said, I don't know how many ways. But little did they know, as more and more people were buying and eating Wonder Bread, they were getting pellagra. There was an epidemic of pellagra, or I don't know if we could call it an epidemic, but people were getting pellagra from eating Wonder Bread. So instead of saying, people didn't get pellagra when they ate whole grain bread, why is this happening? They said, let's just put the B vitamins back in. Let's put calcium, let's put vitamin A, and they called it enriched. So this is the illustration of a theme that's going to come back again and again and again in this lecture. Capitalism, i.e. the motive to mass produce efficiently and create profit, will create a problem through an unintended consequence of that motive. And then instead of trying to understand the cause of that problem, will invent a new solution and sell it to you. So to understand a little bit more about capitalism, we need to understand the role of 3 people and how they influenced our food system, the outsized influence that they have on our food system today. The first is Milton Friedman. So the prevailing economic theory in America prior to the 1970s was something called Keynesianism, which says that capitalism has natural booms and busts, where there are cycles of increased demand and then overproduction and then economic bust. And that what Keynes said is that the government should regulate prices, regulate businesses to help smooth out these sort of fluctuations. Because who bears the brunt of the busts? It's not the rich people, it's poor, marginalized people. Friedman said the opposite. He said, it doesn't really matter who bears the brunt of the busts. Let's just make the economy go up all together as a whole and kind of go like this with the booms and busts. And that uptrend, the y-axis there, is GDP in particular. So he said when there's a bust, the government's role is to bail out the banks and put money into the top, and that will trickle down to the poor. So we often attribute Reagan to trickle-down economics, but he is actually the foundational thinker that created trickle-down economics. Small government, no regulation, let the market go, and bail out the banks, not the people. This is Milton Friedman in 3 lines. Neoliberalism. This is what we call neoliberalism. When you hear people referring to neoliberalism, they are referring to the ideas of this man and the influence that he has had. Lewis Powell is the second man we have to talk about. At the same time that Milton Friedman was doing his thing, there were a lot of consumer groups, strong labor unions, environmentalists, and they were trying to hold the corporations accountable to the environment, to the consumer, and to their employees. But Lewis Powell and his cronies at the Chamber of Commerce saw this as an impediment to profit. So they said, we are under attack as businesses. Businesses, we have to organize to fight back against these people who are telling us, how dare we be accountable to all these other people. We are just accountable to our shareholders to maximize profit. That is our only, that is the only people that we're responsible to. So he basically wrote a memo to all of the leaders of big business, said, we need to go to Washington and we need to buy political power and organize together. He then became a Supreme Court judge and presided over a couple of decisions that led to set the legal precedent to the Citizens United decision that removes the limit of how much corporations can spend on electoral candidates. So this is why we have billionaires spending billions of dollars in super PACs to support electoral candidates. And this is the video also that I sent out yesterday. This is Robert Reich kind of summarized the story of this as well. So his big effect was money in politics. At the same time, this fellow named Earl Rusty Butz was picked by Nixon to be the USDA secretary. He was a board member at the Purdue Chicken Farm, and he had grown up on a small family farm and cites how hard it was to be a farmer as the motive for his work. Prior to his appointment, the New Deal was using Keynesian economics to regulate farming and incentivizing farmers, paying farmers to produce a little bit less to preserve the soil and to prevent overproduction of grain or overproduction of any products that were going to rot and create depressions. Earl Butz thought this was ludicrous. He said, we have all this new technology. We can mill corn. We can grow tons of corn. We have these new corn seeds that make tons of starch, and we can turn it into anything. We can turn this corn into anything, and we can sell it around the world and make our country the richest country in the world. So this was sort of his thing. Basically, quantity is better than quality. Monocrop is better than diversity. If we specialize and we get really good at corn, something that we can turn into anything, we can become rich. And let's build national wealth with corn. So corn, 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 corn for him. So these three men did their thing. Rise of corporate election spending. Over the years since 1970, exponential rises in corporate spending on electoral candidates. So now, because large corporations have huge influence over the government, while the US dietary guidelines say we should have half of our plate being fruits and vegetables, 4% of government subsidies to farms are going to fruits and vegetables, and the rest are going to corn, livestock, feed, biofuels, exports, processed foods, things like that. Okay. So the consequences of quick profit above all else. This is a documentary called King Corn. Two people were basically like, oh, I heard that I was 90% corn. I wonder why that is. And they go on this journey to Iowa where they try and plant an acre of corn and learn about how much corn has gotten into everything. All of these foods are riddled with corn. High fructose corn syrup is in all of the sweetened beverages that we have. And corn-fed beef, as you can see, is much less nutritious, but it's also more marbled. It's bigger. It can grow the meat faster. That has led to the rise of CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations. Animals are unhealthy because they're packed close together. They eat very unhealthy diets, and they're standing in their own poop and other animals' poop. So there's lots of spread of infectious disease because they have no immune system, because they're not eating anything green. They're just eating corn. They get liver abscesses and they get pumped full of antibiotics. And I know, we talk about antibiotic stewardship in the hospital, and it's a good initiative, but I feel a little bit less bad about giving vancomycin to a patient that I might be septic when I realize that most of antibiotic resistance is actually coming from CAFOs. E. coli H0157 has risen dramatically because of CAFOs. Salmonella in outbreaks have been more and more common, in vegetables that have been in proximity to these processing plants, and again, antibiotic resistance. It also causes environmental disaster. In the past, when people planted corn in North America, when indigenous people plant corn in North America, they know that you can get natural nitrogen fixation by combining what they call the three sisters: corn, squash, and beans. And when you plant them all together, I can't remember exactly the biochemistry of it, but like the rhizomes do something with, they can fix nitrogen from the air and self-fertilize the plants. But in monocrops, they can't do that. So they have to add tons of nitrogen to the soil, which actually we use corn for ethanol and we think it's a clean fuel, but actually more energy goes into the fertilizer than comes out of the corn that we get. So these are just externalizing costs and basically saying we are preserving the profits of the oil companies who distribute the ethanol and not really caring about energy in versus energy out. The consequences of this: the nitrogen fertilizer runs off into the Mississippi River, deposits in the delta, causes what's called a dead zone, where the nitrogen basically causes an algal bloom and no sunlight can get in, no oxygen can get in, all the fish die. This is a red tide in the Mississippi Delta. Or I don't know if it's actually Mississippi, but it's all along the Gulf of Mexico. I want to be precise. Food is less nutritious as a result. We're stripping the topsoil of all its nutrients. This is a report from the organic, I forget the name of the organization, but it's a report called Still No Free Lunch, declining levels of micronutrients in the US food supply. One sort of like soundbite is that like an apple today is a quarter as nutritious as it was in 1940 because of how much we've stripped the topsoil. Other people say we only have 60 seasons of harvest left because of the damage that we're doing to the topsoil. So if you fast forward through the 80s and 90s, you look at the legacy of Friedman, Powell, and Butz, and they've saturated the market with corn-based products in terms of processed foods, high fructose corn syrup, meats that are fed with corn. And because capitalism is unchecked, you get corporate consolidation. Antitrust laws weaken. Corporations are spending money in government to reduce antitrust laws. And you get things like this, where 85% of the beef processing market share is 4 companies. 83% of cereals is 3 companies. 70% of soft drinks is 2 companies. And we get something that looks like this, where this middle step of corporate food processing and corporate consolidation, farmers have fewer options of places to sell to. So the companies keep prices that they're buying at artificially low and that they're selling at the grocery store to us artificially high. And this is the explanation, not just inflation and supply chain things that we pay so much for groceries, especially here in New York. So farmers then need to make more commodity crop, the stuff that they're subsidized for, like the corn, the monocrops. They have to make more of them to make ends meet and keep the lights on and pay their bills. Farms exploit migrant labor for this. So people are like working like slave labor essentially in farms to get our produce to us because of this structure. And then we pay more for it at the grocery store. And I wonder if this structure looks familiar to you at all as a doctor. So in the 1980s and 90s, people started to realize that, okay, diabetes is increasing. These foods might be unhealthy. We're getting MIs. Is it cholesterol? Is it fat? And the low fat craze happens. I don't know if any of you guys remember this, but there were lots of like low fat foods like this that were being marketed with labels. Basically, companies were seeing that people weren't buying their products as much. So they said, we need to sell people a solution to their health. And they put lots of research and development into making low fat foods with these emulsifiers that emulate the textures of fat. This is Dana Small. She was approached, she's a researcher at Yale. She researches the neuropsychology of food reward. And she was approached by Pepsi saying, how can we make a soft drink that has fewer calories, but has just as much like food reward? So she did fMRI studies where she basically individually modified, sort of independently modified sweetness, sugar content, and calories. And she was expecting that the more calories, the more people would like it. because we are engineered to want energy evolutionarily. But what she found was that the actual liking is when calories and sweetness were matched, when our brains are finely tuned to perceive, how much energy we're about to get. And when there is a match there, that is when we actually get the most reward. And she said this was curious. Why would we not just want more energy? So she studied how metabolism functions when our brain is mismatched with actually the energy content that we're getting. And what she found is that we're actually not really capable of metabolizing calories that we're not perceiving. It's not as simple as that. And I don't mean to say that this is the definitive research that definitively proves mechanistically. We do have to maintain skepticism. But the upshot of this is that when she shared these preliminary results with Pepsi, they pulled her funding for the study. So the important part about this is not stop drinking your diet soda. Diet soda is making you sick. Maybe, I don't know. We still need to do more research. But the problem is that food companies have the power to cherry pick the results that they want in science. Okay. So what does this have to do with me as a doctor? I want to talk about fast and slow death. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, the two major causes of death were infectious disease and traumatic injuries, right? Changes in vaccines, antibiotics, surgery, analgesia, hygiene, public sanitation, and supportive care, what we do, all the innovations in supportive care that we have made us much better at taking care of this. And I think I'll speak for myself. This is a big part of why I went into emergency medicine, because we actually can do something in medicine about fast death. We can save people's lives. We're actually kind of good at that. But now, most people, 3/4 of people are dying from complications of chronic disease or chronic diseases themselves. So what happened? Was it genetics? But no, genetics don't change in a generation. And this has happened over the course of a generation. We learned that in high school biology with the Hardy-Weinberg equations. Is it that we're just living long enough now to see chronic disease develop? Well, younger and younger people are getting these. We have young people with decompensated type 2 diabetes. Think about peds. Think about how many 20-year-olds we see in the pods with DKA. So some preliminary research, this stuff is really hard to research. That's sort of the backup of this. But this is a paper in the Lancet that kind of searches for the dietary risks in 195 countries where there are these kind of chronic diseases. And basically, the upshot is that the Western diet, high processed foods, low fruits and vegetables, lots of refined starches and sugars, and lots of salts. There's a very direct correlation with chronic disease, with those dietary risk factors. And similarly, you can do the opposite. This is a study of a cohort of Aboriginal people in Australia who had assimilated and were eating Western diets and had metabolic syndrome. They did an experiment where they ate their traditional diet for a month or so. I don't remember the exact amount of time. And there was improvement, if not resolution, in many of those markers of metabolic dysfunction. And this holds across other traditional diets as well. This is part of the Michael Pollan reading that I sent out as well. Wherever the standard American diet goes, chronic disease goes. Where any traditional diet, that we're adaptable to lots of different traditional diets, and we do okay. This is from the International Health Metrics Evaluation Organization or something like that. Dietary risks are #1 among all of these countries as to the risk for chronic disease and death. This is the same chart as before, of the left side being the chronic diseases that are the major causes of death, and the dark blue is the attributable risk of dietary factors. Ischemic heart disease, hypertensive heart disease, diabetes, CKD, stroke, colorectal cancer. And again, we don't have a lot of research on this because the NIH only actually has 5% of their budget dedicated to diet research. Ultra-processed foods are engineered for addiction. There was an NIH study in which 2 groups were randomized to this matched calorie for calorie, macronutrient for macronutrient, ultra-processed food versus whole food. The people who ate the ultra-processed food diet overate. You can look at the study. It's very I'm trying to be skeptical and cautious about making big claims about single studies, these randomized controlled trials, especially in these things that are hard to study. I'll talk more about this later, but I do think it's interesting in taking a look at how they did this. The upshot or the conclusion that they came to is that UPFs are engineered for addiction. And we see that in the intentions of the company already, but I digress. This is just like they measure metabolic function. It could cause some metabolic dysfunction. They looked at, this is like ultra processed versus unprocessed, how many calories they took. I don't like body weight as like a measure of these things, but they measured it anyway. There are also like the pesticides and how they miss with like our metabolism. They talk about like endocrine disruptors. There's like budding research about this. There's stuff about like the microbiome and how the foods that we're eating are disrupting our microbiome, and how could be implicated in like neurologic disorders, depression, psychiatric disorders. It's all in the nascence of research because it's really hard to study. This is a paper in Nature that sort of outlines systemic chronic inflammation as a mediator for all of the ways that all of these sort of lifestyle risk factors contribute to all of these diseases. It's interesting to read about. It brought me back to my like immunology textbooks of medical school, but there's a lot more to learn. So one might say, okay, we don't really have good research on this. Like, how am I going to like actually make recommendations, good sound clinical recommendations to my patients based on this research? And I would flip the question back and say, how good is the evidence in our most prestigious journals about the medications that we do prescribe and the new advances in medicine that we're actually getting right now? This is an example of lecanemab, which is a monoclonal antibody for early Alzheimer's that's supposed to bind the proteins that are implicated in Alzheimer's in the blood and take them out. This one pager is touting a 26% reduction in slowing, 26% reduction in disease progression for the intervention group versus the placebo group. Published in the New England Journal. $26,000 a year. The study was supported by Eisai, which is the pharmaceutical company that produces the medication, and Biogen. The lead, this was on the front. However, you need to go into the disclosures. Like, you need to click through an extra thing and scroll down a bunch to see that the lead author is a consultant for 16 different pharmaceutical companies. That was not disclosed on the front page. Furthermore, you have to click through to the supplementary appendix to look at this tree chart and see that the results are not statistically significant for women. And they didn't mention that on the one pager. Women are 2/3 of patients with dementia. Furthermore, if you are homozygous for ApoE1, the early onset dementia, severe kind of like genetic risk factor, it's statistically insignificant, but it sits on the right side of the plot, making you worse. None of this was disclosed on the front page, and you have to search for it. This was a trial where there was a randomized controlled trial between people who had like intensive lifestyle interventions, including whole food, plant-based diet, exercise programs, social connection, like meditation classes, and people who just lived their lives. And on 2 of 3 cognitive tests, there was actually improvement at 20 weeks, not just slowing of progression compared to the control group, but there was reversal. In one of them, there was statistically significant slowing of reversal. So again, got to be fair, the wellness industrial complex certainly exists. The authors of this study are also like trying to start companies to measure labs, like to measure your microbiome, do things like that. There's bias everywhere. There's profit motive everywhere. But the difference is there is no big kale, right? There is no large consolidated monopolistic industry behind the variety of wellness lifestyle interventions that can be helpful in managing chronic disease like there is in big pharma. I already talked about the NIH having only 5% of their budget dedicated to the effects of diet. And I want to talk about the burden of proof. All right. So I love that in this residency, we are taught to be skeptical. We are taught that most research is trash, and we need to have a really high standard before recommending something to our patients. And I think that's a really good sign. It's a really good philosophy. What's difficult is that it's really easy. It's easier. It's still really hard. What am I saying? It's really hard, but possible to study drugs and get statistically significant results where you do a randomized controlled trial with a placebo and an intervention, a pill that you can take. And you control for all these other risk factors like age and socioeconomics and etc. But systems that are constantly trying to compensate and have positive and negative feedback loops that create homeostasis, the increasing degrees of freedom of how many mechanisms, how many feedback loops we have in our bodies are hard to study. So we can't really study every single effect of all the different things that diet could be influencing us. That's really, really hard. It's really expensive. And there are too many variables to actually get that level of confidence that we can get with just drug or placebo. And I feel like I hear a lot from standardized medical community of saying our priorities aren't really with diet. This stuff isn't really our domain, right? Kale's not going to cure cancer, like food, like we can't make diet, like these are sort of like the ways that I hear the medical institutions waving off diet as like quackery, essentially. And I would ask us to look at climate change as an example of this. We do not have a randomized controlled trial that tells us how climate change works, but we see changes in huge systems that associate with human activity. And we are learning mechanisms that help put together the puzzle pieces to, at this point, I don't have 5 sigma proof that humans cause climate change like for any one reason, but I think we should probably change our behavior and we should change policy. And I would argue that we need to do the same with diet. Throughout our history, we've been bought out by big tobacco, and until we weren't. We were bought out by big corn until we weren't. And it shows that we have power to advocate and change things. I'll go over some ways that we can be a part of that in a little bit. But I think the upshot is we need to realize that we're inextricably linked with farmers and we have to be in solidarity with them. So what to do about this? Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. This is the sort of like pithy advice of Michael Pollan in all of his writing about food. It's really hard to do in residency. We're going to talk about this together, but we all know food is a social determinant of health. It intersects with race, class, gender, immigration status. And food is really expensive, and not just in money, but also in time. And as residents, we have not a lot of time, and also for a lot of us, not a lot of money too. So that's why when I send my patients home, my favorite medication to prescribe on discharge is actually a work note. I tell them the medications I give, the Tylenol and Advil that I'm going to give you for your pain are not going to help heal you. They'll help you deal with the symptoms, but this is what's going to heal you is taking time to sleep, rest, connect with loved ones, eat really well, drink a lot of water, and take care of yourself. I find that, we have no moral high ground as doctors. We are not exemplars of taking good care of ourselves. If we had time for motivational interviewing, which is an evidence-based way of counseling people through behavior change, that would be great, but it's really hard in the ED. I find in my experience that I'll share with you guys, uniting around a common enemy, my patients' eyes light up when I say, look, like there are forces that are conspiring to keep us sick. I am not going to purport to tell you, you already know what's good food and what's not good food. Like here are I'll offer some resources that can help, make that a little bit easier to obtain. But the sort of paternalism of like talking down to patients is never helpful. And that's just a bit of my experience that I've found helpful that I would offer to you guys if you guys with this information want to share some of it. Kings County has a lifestyle medicine program that you can refer patients to. You can reach out to me, or I heard about it from Sam. So if you want to reach out to Sam, we can learn more about that in the e-building. There are CSAs, which is direct relationships with farms, where they send boxes to your house of their produce. That helps farmers. It cuts out the middleman in that graphic that we saw earlier. There are farmers markets, and Grow NYC does a lot of education around the city about like regenerative, sustainable agriculture. Shop the periphery of the supermarket. That's where all the whole foods are. The processed foods are in the middle. Community gardens. If you join a community garden, it's a great way to get in touch with neighbors, form relationships, build solidarity, build power, and get close to the earth and get familiar with what where your food comes from. And food banks and pantries. Dr. Dada, Dr. Arcachea, and I have been working on creating some dot phrases for Canva referrals that contain a QR code and all the information that patients need to take a Canva referral. So if you search my dot phrases or Dr. Arcachea's dot phrases or Dr. Dada's dot phrases for dot Canva food, you'll see the dot phrase. And then, it's really hard to change legislation so systemically when so much of subsidies for farms are federal. I find that a good way to hit big corporations where it hurts is through labor. So if you hear of a fast food strike, or if you hear of a meat packers strike, or any sort of food industry strike, I would consider contributing to their strike fund, standing on the picket line with them, or just spreading awareness that it's going on, and asking other people to do the same things. The Farm Bill is the piece of legislation that determines where food subsidies go, and you can Google it to learn more about it. That's my lecture. Please give me feedback. You can find additional works that weren't like in the slides on the additional works I did. I'm going to give you guys a second to take pictures of this, and then I'm going to give questions for reflection for you guys. So how has residency changed your relationship to food? How do you feel about the food system and how it impacts us and our patients? And what role are doctors best positions to play in advocating for a better food system?